So here we are, beginning of the second reading. Where are they? What has happened so far? Socrates has tried to inquire into the nature of virtue with Meno, and this inquiry has had a certain effect on Meno, he says, and that he's been torpified, he's torpid, he's stunned, like he's been stung by an electric eel. And Socrates and him joke a little bit about this. But Socrates says something quite interesting. He says, right here, as to my being a torpedo, if the torpedo is torpid as well as the cause of torpidity in others, then indeed I am a torpedo. Torpedo. I guess torpidity is just kind of being stunned, being torpid, being not having a thought in your head. You know. Then indeed I am a torpedo, but not otherwise. For I perplex others not because I am clear, but because I am utterly perplexed myself. That's Socrates' main point: is that he's not a teacher; he's an asker of questions, and that, like the people he asks the questions of, he's ignorant. He's looking for knowledge, doesn't have it. And now I know not what virtue is, and you seem to be in the same case. So where are they? What have they done? Well, at least Socrates and Meno can agree now that neither of them knows what virtue is. Remember, in the beginning of the dialogue, Meno is shocked to hear Socrates say that he doesn't know what virtue is. But now, Socrates has convinced Meno, at least on the surface, that he doesn't know either. So here they are. And now I know not what virtue is, and you seem to be in the same case, although you did once perhaps know before you touched me. However, I have no objection to join with you in the inquiry. So now that we sort of cleared the boards, neither of us thinks that we know what we really don't know. Both of us realize that we don't know. So let's look for what we want to know. Let's look into the nature of virtue. And it's at that point when Socrates establishes that neither of them know what virtue is, and that's key, that Meno raises his objection. Let's call it Meno's paradox. Meno's paradox of inquiry. And here it is, right here. And how will you inquire, Socrates, into that which you do not know? What will you put forth as the subject of inquiry? And if you find what you want, how will you ever know that this is the thing which you did not know? Suppose like so much of the beginning of this course, or maybe the course as a whole, depends on what you think of that objection. As we'll see, Socrates tries to dismiss it peremptorily, right away. But it may have a lot more going for it than that. Let's think about it just a little bit. Socrates doesn't know what virtue is. He does not know what it is. Meno does not know what it is. And so Meno says, well, how are we going to look for it then if we don't know what it is? Mhm. What will you put forth as a subject? And how will we even get started if we don't know what it is? How will we begin to look for it if we're ignorant of what it is? And even if by some just great stroke of luck we were to find it, how would we even know that that's what we were looking for? Because we don't know what we're looking for. How would we recognize it? How would we begin to inquire? And even if we were lucky enough to stumble across it, how would we know that that's what we were looking for? I don't know. It seems like to me, a pretty good point. That is, if we're both utterly ignorant of what it is, if we both have no idea what it is, how will we ever find it? And that leads into the whole drama of the second part of the dialogue, in which Socrates says this is not a real problem because we don't really have to learn anything new. Since our souls are immortal, they've already learned all things, but they've forgotten them. So all we need to do is remember or recollect what we already know, but have forgotten. So if all knowledge or all learning is recollection, then all we need to do is to recollect what we already know. That is, it is possible to find out the truth about about virtue and anything else, because even though we don't know what it is, we have only to remember what we used to know, I suppose. That is, I guess, the process of asking questions and inquiry is to stimulate our memory of it. So if we already know what it is, but we've forgotten it, we just need to remember, then Meno's objection, his paradox, would seem to be overcome. But uh, Meno is, of course, like all the rest of us, a little bit skeptical about this thesis that all knowledge is simply recollection. And so Socrates tries to prove that with the slave boy. Meno has kind of a retinue with him, one of which is a boy who's his slave. And Socrates says, well, if he can answer questions about geometry, having never learned geometry, then this will prove my thesis, because it'll prove that, well, if he can correctly answer questions about geometry without having learned geometry, it means he must already know it, just like we must already know what virtue is. And what follows is a very interesting back and forth between Meno and the boy, the slave boy, about the relationship between the side and the diagonal of a square. If you look it up, I think I have it here somewhere. It's fairly easy, even for somebody who has. Oh, I just messed it up. Um, ugh, it's too bad. I had it first. I just closed it. Let's see. Maybe I can regain it. Yeah, here it is. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting example that Socrates uses, and I don't think it's any real accident. Meno or Socrates is asking the boy, if you have a square of a certain area, let's see a square here of 4 feet, 2 feet, you know, 2 foot size, meaning the whole area is four. The question is, what would be the side for a square that's twice the area? That is an 8 foot square. And after some problems, Socrates shows them how to find that side. That is, if these four squares here all have sides of 2 feet, um, then if we draw a diagonal through each one of them, bisecting an area, that'll be the um, that'll be an 8 foot square, and that'll be what we're looking for. So the line that we're looking for is the diagonal of the original square that we started with, the 4 foot square. It's actually really neat and very simple proof that even a person like me who's not mathematically inclined can follow. But it also obviously has, if anybody knows here knows anything about Greek mathematics, it's discovery of irrational numbers, because there's no commensurability between the side and diagonal of a square. You can't find a common measure between them, and it leads to the idea of irrational numbers, which is a huge discovery in Greek mathematics, but also quite a problem for people who are inclined to believe that all mathematics has to be rational and decidable. So it leads in all sorts of interesting directions. Too much for us to go into here, highly speculative. But that's the question, the mathematical question that Socrates follows out with the slave boy. And it's really fascinating, and it's meant to show, like, hey, man, we can do this. You and if this little kid who you kept in ignorance as your slave can figure out this question in geometry, then certainly you and I, who have had the benefit of educations, can look into the nature of virtue. And Socrates trying to get Meno to, you know, to do it, and as we see at the end of it, Meno's not really he's not really up for it. But it's really a fascinating, one of the most important steps, perhaps, in the history of philosophy, a philosopher looking at the question, Meno's paradox. How do you look for something that you don't already know? And that seems like a silly question, but it's important enough to have led Socrates to develop this very extravagant theory of recollection as a way to overcome it. A theory that he himself says that he's not quite sure of. Somewhere at the end of this, yeah, at the end of this section, towards the end of it, he says, "And I, Meno, like what I am saying. Some things I have said of which I am not. Some things I have said of which I am not altogether confident." That is, Socrates himself knows that this theory of knowledge as recollection really is quite a daring thesis and not obviously true. But that we shall be better and braver and less helpless if we think that we ought to inquire than we should have been if we indulged in the idle fancy that there was no knowing and no use in seeking to know what we do not know. That is the theme upon which I am ready to fight in word and deed to the utmost of my power. Almost as if to say, well, I'm not really sure about this knowledge of recollection thing, but I'll go with it as long as it provides a basis for continuing to look into the truth of the things that we do not know, because that's important to do, to preserve.